I'm not really, as my board likes to tell me a lot, like, oh, you're not from the labor movement or you're new to the labor movement, even though I've been in my job for 4 years. But I was a community member who really felt passionate about Apollo's mission. I really love how intergenerational Apollo is. The chapter in DC, which is where I normally live, there's retirees, there's students, there's young workers, there's, millennials, like the whole gamut of folks. And everyone was just working together to identify what's going on in DC with the Asian American community. How are ways that we can interject and try to uplift economic justice issues in DC? And I felt really inspired by that and joined Apollo pretty much after I moved to DC and was a chapter leader for, 10 years and got really involved at the national office. And then when this executive director position opened up, folks were like, oh, well, you should think about applying. And I was like, me? Like, I'm just a chapter leader. All of my work was in sort of like the democracy and civic engagement work leading up to that. And they were like, well, this is work that we want to build out within Apollo. We are really thinking about when we talk about building power for Asian American Pacific Islander people, we need to build our political muscle so that we can have a seat at the table. And that's your background. So that's kind of why, we're interested in you coming to this organization. So and it's been such a joy because I was like, I get to be paid to do this thing I do for fun on the side, and you're just gonna, pay me to do that, 80 hours a week now. That's great. So, here I am 4 years later, and it's been a real big learning curve, which I can talk more about later. But I had a couple slides. I'm more of a visual person, so I have a couple slides about Apollo as an organization, and we'll get back into questions. So let me share my screen real quick. Oh man, why are you doing this to me, Zoom? All right, I'm not going to share my screen. All of a sudden, it's like, you need to enable all these things. I'm like, I've done this a million times. All right, that's fine. So the vision of Apollo is really, we envision a society where economic and racial justice prevails, human rights and worker dignity are affirmed, and where a healthy, sustainable planet is able to offer a better life for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks in all communities fighting oppression. We recently just wrote our vision statement last year, and we feel like it's important to really lift up not just what people might name the bread and butter economic justice issues or labor issues, but also all of the things that impact our communities as workers, as working families. And so that's why we were really intentional about that. And we're also really intentional in uplifting, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, because I think for us, some of our communities, especially East Asians, are much more privileged in many ways. And we know that if we can center Black lives, if we can center Indigenous folks, then all of our communities are going to benefit from that. And so we try to take that approach with our work. And one thing, again, that really inspires me about Apollo is it was founded in 1992. It was one of the newer constituency groups of the AFL. And the very first action that our founding members took at their convention was to march on the Department of Justice, Rodney King. And a lot of people are like, for Rodney King, like he's not even Asian, or this is not even a labor issue. And I think that really speaks to the intentionality of, intersectionality. And that wasn't even a word back then, right? That our founders were like, we're not here just for labor issues. We're not here just for our community. And we're here because there's a broader community and we need to be in solidarity with other communities. And that is something that, I really appreciate about how intentional Apollo is about racial equity issues. And not to say that we're perfect or that we're perfectly anti-racist, because truth be told, Apollo is tied to the labor movement. All of our founders came from the labor movement, and it's an institution that's steeped in white supremacy. So whether or not folks mean it, white supremacy traits are just baked into our structure, or baked into how we treat each other, or baked into a lot of really toxic behaviors that coincidentally are all kind of coming to a head right now. And maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but my staff actually just wrote an open letter to the board about how they feel, you don't see us as real workers, we're disrespected all the time, all these things. And I really think it speaks to the moment that we are in as a movement about how we are really questioning our values, what we're trying to push and how that may or may not align with us as organizations. So it's a really interesting moment. I think it's terrifying in many ways, but it also is really exciting because it represents a lot of opportunity for us to walk the walk and examine our own organizations and unpack colonialism and unpack white supremacy, in order to just be accountable to the movement, be accountable to the communities that we're trying to work for. Um, I
So
went on a,
that's a great
yeah.
segue, Alvina. One of the things in our class we talked about, and I just posted in the chat this article about like how movements recover. We're in a really different year, right? So many things have been brought to the surface as a result of like the events and activities of the year, right? And so, how do we, um, speaking to your statement, I mean, I think that that's an important step. But how do we, that in this article, they use the Catholic Church in North Africa as an example of how, in some cases there's a model where you double down on the church, and in the language of the article you kind of build the ark and get everybody in there. Or how do you open up the church and make it a vehicle for social change? But I think that that's applicable to all of the movement work, both in the church and in the labor movement, that we are endeavor to do. So, what are you, how are you reflecting on, how we um, deal with the economic and social justice work that has been uncovered by the essential workers, and how they have been overlooked but now are vital to the functioning of our economy? Or the policing issues that we are grappling with, and especially as a labor movement, how do we deal with policing? Well, how were you thinking about that, and how was your organization, you know thinking about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, great questions. On the essential worker piece, we've got about 2 million workers that are AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, that are frontline workers. And this past year, I think not only are we facing this health pandemic, crisis, but also many of the workers who are East Asian or look Chinese are also facing increased racism on the job because of all of the sort of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian rhetoric. Um, and then that's not to say also the disproportionate impact of the disease itself on some of the Pacific Islander communities or Southeast Asian communities. And so I think like many, like we just had no choice. We had to throw ourselves all in on like how do we uplift these issues that are happening. Um, and I think it's hard because we do try to center like Black lives and like Black and brown lives in our work, but also sometimes we also get left out of the narrative completely, right? And so we want to say like we want to center these communities, but also like we exist too, right? So we spent a lot of time in the early part of the pandemic just releasing like guidance on protecting AAPI workers, on racism on the job. And we sent that out through our labor partners, and hopefully they sent them out to their employers. But just like, here are all the ways that workers can and should be protected. And we're not just talking about health and sanitation, but we're talking about discrimination on the job, comments that they might hear in the workplace, even from their own, coworkers or supervisors. And that's one thing. And then we also spent a lot of time just interviewing essential workers and making sure we uplift their stories and their unique perspectives. And I'll drop a link in the chat later of our video series, but I'm really proud of us being able to just uplift some of those stories. Um, Another really interesting stat is I think Filipino nurses were making up something like 30+% of COVID related deaths on the job, but they were
Ooh.
only 17% of the workforce, right? So even when you look at the disproportionate impact of COVID in workplaces, I think that was something that we wanted to lift up as well. Um, and then on sort of like the policing piece, that's really interesting. definitely, I think most people think, oh, well, mass incarceration, that's like a Black community issue. And that's absolutely not true. And something Apollo has been trying to do is uplift that issue and talk about it within the Asian American community. We're part of this coalition called AAPI's Beyond Bars. And it's really looking at the impact of the school to prison to deportation pipeline in immigrant communities. And that's something that happens particularly a lot in the Southeast Asian communities. And so we're really proud as an organization to be able to lift up that narrative and work with our partners to um, be in coalition with folks that are formerly incarcerated to kind of talk about that issue. Some of our founding members and professors went into some of the prisons and taught about Asian American history, taught about labor history, and kind of connected the dots around that work. So it's not just uplifting the issue in our own community, but this last year, we talked a lot about defunding the police. And that is, I mean, in some circles, not that radical, but in the labor community, very radical because of all the connotations that mean around like labor and like a union and who should be protected by labor contracts and things. And that debate got really, really heated in Apala. And I think there's a moment of crisis in the organization where we're kind of identifying like, are we an organization that's here to uplift the Asian American Pacific Islander community, or are we merely AAPI members that are, representatives of our unions, and we're here to just to distill what our unions want? Um, and I don't think we fully answered that question, and that might be an existential question for us for all time. But in the end, we did get the resolution passed, and I think that's a big step forward. There are a lot of our board members that were maybe personally for it, but they were like, my union would never want me to vote on this, so stepped out or maybe made things a little bit more difficult. But I think that's our job as a constituency group. We're not here to just be, the AAPI social club and we all happen to be union members or represent the labor movement. Like, we're here because we, I think, are here to push the labor movement forward. We're here to take statements and positions that maybe the broader labor movement are not comfortable or not ready to take. And I really see constituency groups as part of the vanguard of the labor movement in terms of many of the constituency groups have one foot in community organizations, one foot in labor. And that is how labor should be thinking about their work, much more connected to the grassroots, much more connected to communities of color. And, that's what I see our role as.
Absolutely.
Alvina,
I think that's why have been great friends. So Marcus, I see you got a question. Go ahead.
yeah, I just reflecting on all this, especially after working in the AFL-CIO for many years. And I think it's an interesting time because I think these issues of culture and race and the different constituency groups in their organization within the AFL-CIO, they were organized in the past, as a way to expand sort of union values and engage folks, but it hasn't been clear at times, exactly what the role of these groups are within the AFL-CIO. It's kind of goes back and forth and figuring out, and sometimes this constituent groups kind of feel, I think, pretty disconnected from the traditional AFL-CIO establishment. And then I think now, particularly with the challenges that are facing the country and essentially the issues that have always been there but are rising to the surface around issues of color and the economic impact of the economy on people of color. I guess I'm really interested from your perspective, just the balance there of trying to raise, to use these constituent groups to build a coalition of people from all different groups together around specific economic issues, but at the same time struggling with these issues of race that are going on at the same time. That's a really challenging piece. And I think a part of what we're seeing now is a lot of the leadership of the unions are starting to change, particularly because the sort of baby boom generation is sort of getting to retirement based on the sort of union parameters of being able to retire, at 65 or before or whatever. And so you're starting to see those folks move into retirement and move on. And that basically is putting a whole nother generation of folks moving into leadership roles or preparing to move into leadership roles. And so we're in a really interesting time, I think within the next 10 years, you're going to see a dramatic shift on who's in leadership and how that happens. And you're going to see many people of color rising up in those positions. And that in itself will be a tense relationship because it's, just like we see it in American politics, it's going to be a challenging thing. So I'm really interested in your interaction there of, how we do this work around race, but at the same time stay connected to the deep sort of economic labor issues that are inherent in the injustice really that's going on in our society. And that's across the board, through people in all directions essentially are being exploited, maybe in different ways in parts, but they're still victims of the system basically. So I'm interested in your kind of input on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a weird chicken or the egg phenomenon with the constituency groups. When they first started, many of them got, I would say, the majority of their funds from contributions from the AFL and from other affiliate unions. And I think for better or worse, that's been a bit detrimental because through the years, that number has dwindled when budgets have been cut, when there have been attacks on unions. It's like, well, where can we cut? Okay, constituency groups. And so it's dwindled down to the point where I'd say AAPI is probably one of the largest, best funded constituency groups. And we have 5 full-time staff, which I think, given the level of work we feel like we need to do is wholly insufficient. Some of the other constituency groups have one completely underpaid executive director, and that's it. And so when you think about the work that needs to happen, it's very, very under-resourced. Apollo, we've been a little bit lucky in that we've been seeking some foundational money and we've been trying to branch out, but it's sort of this negative dynamic where it's like, well, the constituency groups are so tiny, what do they even do? And then, well, let's cut their money. And then, so it's kind of a vicious cycle in that way. But I think there's a lot of potential there. I think we among the constituency groups have our own coalition. We try to do as much collectively as we can. This past election cycle, we wrote one election plan, and those of us that could do more work, we just shared it, and we shared our staff, and we had joint phone banks so that everybody could be able to talk to the different constituencies that they needed to, and still be able to say, well, look, here's how we're adding to the work and adding to the moment. But I think to the question on leadership and things changing in the next 10 years, I mean, I think it's going to happen. I don't know if that's going to be fast enough. 10 years from now, I'm feeling definitely the urgency of now and all of these different crises coming together. And I think externally, the grassroots community in many ways has written off the labor movement. And we're going to need to see change at a higher level faster if we are to sort of reclaim in popular sense why the labor movement should be a trusted partner in racial justice. And yeah, I'll stop there. But I see a question in the chat about the role of, if any, faith in religious institutions. Not explicitly, and this was one thing, Vonda had kind of prepped me for, and I was like thinking about it, not explicitly, but I can say that many of AAPI leadership, we do like regular like Tai Chi at all of our like board meetings, and I wouldn't say that it's explicitly religious in any way, but I do think that much of our leadership, many of them are Buddhist, many of them are Taoist. There are different sort of like traditions that we bring into our work. And then I've been thinking about it a lot too over the past couple of years. I've always said that I was raised Christian, and then later on, but we're culturally Buddhist. And then, I was like, I think I'm just agnostic. I'm trying to figure it out still. But I went through a leadership program called the Asian Pacific American Women's Leadership Institute. And that was the whole core and philosophy around it was around like Zen Buddhism and like how we are social justice leaders through that philosophy. And so I think that's impacted a lot of my personal thinking on it, but not sort of organizationally in any official way.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because that was one of the questions I wanted to ask was specifically about your input about Asian Pacific workers and particularly members of AAPI, sort of what influences you saw from people's religious and spiritual backgrounds on their commitments to labor and labor organizing. And you kind of brought it up already, but I was particularly interested in traditions from Eastern religion and spiritual practice from Eastern religion. I mean, there's always seems to tend to be in religion sometimes this, tension between sort of the collective mentality of what labor needs and what people's spiritual beliefs become very personalized. So I was wondering in particular if you had any kind of experience, particularly about folks coming into labor organizing from the Eastern religious traditions, Asian religious traditions, and like what influence that had, or specifically to, some the Asian Christian sort of movements that are in the United States, and like what influence that has, and do you see that, and what the relationship between those churches and say AAPI members is like, and how that affects their labor commitments. I mean, I think, in general, that all that is really interesting, and I think none of us really totally understand it in many directions, but I'm really interested in how you've seen it in AAPI.
I wish it was more explicit to answer that question. I find that question fascinating myself. I feel like it comes up inside conversations in between breaks at board meetings and things like that, but not explicitly so. And it's something that I think I want to have a more directed conversation around. But I wish I could answer your question.
Well,
So,
I mean, yeah, I'm not. I just thought it was interesting. You're talking about coming from a Buddhist background. What's your influence? I think particularly on the Buddhist practice and the labor organizing. What have you seen that people have drawn on, and particularly, I guess, the Zen practice that you went through in the leadership program.
I mean, I think in that program, it was a lot about like personal leadership and incorporating some of the Zen Buddhism in like how you approach your own personal leadership and how you center yourself. And there was a lot we did in some of our movements. We practiced a version of Tai Chi every morning that was really interesting because it was literally like the movements were mimicking, like bringing in our history of our communities, like pushing our movements forward. And maybe it was like, this is not the right word, like a physical version of a mnemonic device to help us remember the movements. But I do appreciate sort of how our teachers were very explicit in talking about like, we are, building the community, like bringing in the past. Yeah.
Yeah. So through that physical action, that's interesting. Thank you.
So York had a question around the lines of race and class, but I'd ask York to, frame his question. Probably didn't get all that I should have.
Yeah, thank you. This is really fascinating. I mean, there's so many important issues here. By the way, I just put this name B.R. Ambedkar in the chat. He's an Indian who was raised as a Hindu converted to Buddhism and read Buddhism in this engaged perspective. It's fascinating work. He's one of the architects of the Indian Constitution. We're learning a lot. I mean, I'm learning a lot from him in terms of what we're talking about. So there's lots of resources. There's also this whole world of so-called engaged Buddhism, including folks like Thich Nhat Hanh and others. So this is something else we'd love to talk more about. But my question is about this race and class issue. So I think it's very clear, as you have pointed out, that there's quite a bit of racism going around in the unions and of course everywhere in society, right? It goes all the way to the core. And so in a way, it's clear that has to be fought. My question is, what are some of the tools that this can happen? And this is where I'm wondering, the unions in some ways are doing something to fight racism that's not always acknowledged. I mean, even though there's racism within the institution, if you think about empowerment of minority communities, at work, organizing minority workers and so on. People think this is all about class issues, but it's also fighting racism, right? By empowering minority communities, you're doing something that the church hasn't even really quite discovered yet, or theological studies. We think we have to protest a lot. But the other piece here, I think, is also crucial. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this broader way of fighting racism by empowering people economically, by bringing a sort of solidarity that then, on the one hand, fights racism in the broader system, but also has the potential to fight racism within the union. So it sort of turns back on itself by building solidarity among people that might not be in solidarity otherwise.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been leaning a lot on this document over the past couple of years, from standing up for our racial justice surge, has this thing on like unpacking white supremacist characteristics in the workplace. And I think it's a really good intro tool, because you're like, do you want to unpack white supremacy in the workplace? And people are like, yeah, of course. And then it has these 12 traits and things like a false sense of urgency or perfectionism, or just sort of like capitalistic traits that we perpetuate in workplaces. Not to say that these things are always bad, but in totality are ways that it kind of perpetuates and creates workplaces that are that don't work for communities of color. And so we've taken a look at that in AAPI, and it's something that I'm trying to also bring up through this racial justice task force that I'm a part of through the AFL-CIO, and to think about like, what are ways where we as a labor movement, we as an organization may do these things, and how are they potentially harming communities of color, and what are possible antidotes? Another really interesting sort of dichotomy I looked at recently was sort of like colonial frameworks versus indigenous frameworks. And it's really similar in the ways that like colonialism values like metrics and outcomes, and indigenous frameworks are more about like community building and things like that. And again, it's not always like a dichotomy of like, this is good and this is bad, but just recognizing some of these things. And I've been interested in these sorts of frameworks as a tool to like gently call out racism, and to just sort of unpack like how we're internalizing a lot of that. And I think those are ways we can start to have conversations about our individual practices that might hopefully lead to like movement-wide thinking about, as a labor movement, like how are we perpetuating white supremacy? And like, you're right, it's all intertwined. So I firmly believe the way that AAPI centers racial justice isn't a secondary issue to economic justice, and that's why it is one of our core principles.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful.
So we have lots of questions coming in the chat. Francisco is next in the stat. So Francisco.
Hi, Alvina. So yeah, my question, and it's sort of just reflecting on what you discussed in terms of what you do, sort of the staff meetings, and how religion sort of plays maybe like a informal or a subtle presence in and out. And my experience in organizing in Los Angeles with with labor and with sort of faith constituencies that were connected with labor, one of them being CLU, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, was that there was significant AAPI representation, say, in Christian sort of community, and not so much in sort of the other faith traditions, whether Buddhism, Taoism, or and others. And so, but it's funny though, like there was Buddhist representation, but they were like white Buddhist, and so, which obviously it's great that they were engaged in the work of justice, but I'm wondering about obviously the more grassroots, AAPI, traditions, and I just wonder why you think that might be the case. Like how can sort of there can be greater engagement, or to lift up these traditions and the commitments that relate to economic justice, racial justice, etc.
I have no credibility to be speaking on this at all, so I'll lead with that. But I wonder if, I think about like growing up, like when we went to temple, like it was all in language, right? And my parents went to a Vietnamese temple, but they spoke to us in Chinese. So I don't speak Vietnamese. So even I was like, I have no idea what's going on right now. I'm just going to sit in the corner and wait for the time when we get to eat the tasty like vegetarian meal at the end. But like, I think about that and I was like, do I see folks like my parents, like getting into other sort of interfaith spaces or talking, you know, I was like, I don't know if it's a language thing. And maybe that's why, you know, the Buddhists that are showing up in those spaces are like white because they speak English, or I think about the teachers that were part of my language program. They were second, third, fourth generation Asian American. So I wonder if it's also like an immigrant generational language thing. That's kind of my guess at it.
So thank you. There's been quite a bit in terms of resources posted in the chat, which I think add a whole lot of richness to our conversation. I hope that, you know, all of you will look at some of those resources. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Yor, for providing those. In the final, we have about 10 minutes. Are there other questions that folks want to talk about? You know, I don't know. I'm thinking this morning about the fact that we have a package that is being held up to help people in terms of providing support when folks are losing jobs. And, you know, we can't get any discussion about it because of the rules in the Senate and having to settle those first. And, you know, I'm really thinking about how as a community, how as a labor movement, how as faith leaders, when folks are needing access to healthcare, when they are needing those resources, you know, how do we show up in those moments as, you know, a moral authority on those? And so I was wondering, Alvina, if you had any thoughts about that? And then if other folks have any final questions, we'll take those.
How do we show up in moments as a moral authority? I think we just do, right? I think there's like a lot of, I don't know, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I just don't think there's an option or an opinion or at this, there's not an option to do otherwise at this moment. You know, the fact that I get to be paid to do this kind of work is, again, like such a blessing. And so like, I try to tell my staff, like, I do hold them to a high standard. It's like, we're here, we're lucky to be here, we're lucky to do this work. I think about parents like mine, I think about the backgrounds and the families that my staff come from, and it's like, some of them didn't have that opportunity. And so I think connected to a question on working with local refugee and immigrant worker communities, yes, we do. Our chapters are connected to some local organizations, some local worker centers. We'd love to do more and be more intentional about that. That's one thing I want to shift more resources into. But yeah, and the other thing about being in a national organization, there's always this tension of like not trying to speak on behalf of local communities. So we try to do what we can to be in conversation community with local, real, like there's union folks, but then there's also folks that don't have the opportunity to be in a union, and how do we make sure that we are in community with them and making sure we're lifting up their issues.
Alvina, can you talk a little bit more just about that, about how you guys try and do that and stay in touch? I'd love to hear more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways. Structurally on our board, half are appointed by our chapter, so they represent our local chapter leaders. And then the other sort of chunks sort of run from the board. So it's a very democratic institution. And then we have certain partnerships with different worker centers on the national level on programming around the year, you know, working on one right now in the Holly community around nail salon workers in New York. You know, we've done stuff with different worker centers. There's a lot, particularly in Southern California, actually, where I am now. So I think there's sometimes like different policy things that we're trying to push locally that we try to amplify, and sometimes there's legislative stuff nationally that we try to amplify. We're trying to do like a convening that we want to pay for at some point to bring together all worker centers that work within the AAPI labor movement, and I'd love to fundraise for that and just kind of create some sort of like national network. So that's sort of some of the things I'm thinking about.
And seeing how we're kind of ticking down on time here, we've got a few minutes left. I would really love to hear from many of our fellows. I know there's been a lot of talking going on and chatting, but we've got some space left, and you really get good to hear your perspective or interest. I know this is kind of an unusual topic, and it's really kind of a thing, sort of many of us, don't even know about these constituent groups. Even inside the AFL-CIO, inside the membership, there's often not a real understanding about how these groups work. But in particular, I'd be interested in hearing just any kind of question or anything that's kind of rose from this discussion today, or anything that you would like to have more clarity on. So I just wanted to kind of open it up for a minute or two to y'all out there.
There was a question by Toy in the chat. Toy, you want
Toy, yeah,
to put out there? I
please.
think that's an important question.
Sorry. Yeah, I think Alvina have already touched upon, covered the question around how the, AP, what is it called? Sorry.
Apollo.
Yeah, the Apollo and Apollo and then the local refugee community. So yeah, I think she have already responded to that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just looking. I'll ask the question. Does Apollo work with local Asian refugee immigrant worker communities? If so, can you please say any more about the work you do? I have learned about Apollo's work around racial and immigrant justice. I don't know if there's anything additional you want to add, Alvina?
Oh, I didn't see
that. No, not other than what I said already.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate the Alvina's response. That I've learned that the generation gaps in a community, right? So I am much more in touch with first generation refugees and immigrants. So try to figure out the struggle by our own, by ourselves, rather than reaching out to the local or other networking, and major challenges like normalizing racism. Oh, this is where we are now. We got to get through it. What can we do? There's lots of and heard and spoken, lots of things in a generation gap. And I appreciate what you're doing and trying to bring in or bridge a gap between these generations. So yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, quickly to that point, I'll be frank, there's a lot of anti-Blackness in the Asian community that we're trying to unpack and address. And that's something that we're trying to create more in-language resources are and partner with other Asian American racial justice organizations to name and talk to our elders about. And, blame it on colonialism, blame it on like white-led media. There's a lot of reasons, but I think that's a big barrier too. And especially with first generation or recently immigrated folks. And there's a rise in right-wing conservatism in Asian communities. I think part of that is sort of taken for granted that our communities are taken for granted by larger, more progressive organizing bodies or even like traditional democratic politics. And there are folks that are investing resources in language to organize our communities. And we've seen impacts of that around affirmative action, around a lot of the policing this past year, just like sort of pockets of really well organized first generation folks, like in language, that is going to be a problem and a reckoning that we're going to have within the Asian American community.
Well, Alvina, I just want to say that with everything else that you have going on in your life, we just certainly appreciate you carving space out to be here with us this morning. I have really enjoyed, I see 2 or 3, yep. I have really enjoyed our conversation, and I think that our fellows have too. So come back anytime. We're here on Mondays at the same time, and we would love to have you as a part of our community.